Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us in our broadcast and others of you are joining us on our digital platforms. I'm Philip Martin, Senior Investigative Reporter, GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting. Tonight, voting rights, making every vote count. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We're working with limited staff and our guests are joining us remotely. In his eulogy for the late civil rights leader, Representative John Lewis, former President Obama said, all voters have the power to choose their politicians, not the other way around. Clearly, we're seeing those in power show a blatant disregard for the democratic process to make every vote count. Next door in New Hampshire, legislators are trying to push Georgia-like voter suppression laws inspired by Trump's big lie. Congress has yet to pass the John Lewis voting rights bill. But when the right to vote is suppressed, invalidated, or taken away, what happens then? Has it affected voters' trust and faith in our democracy? Do we feel that our vote counts? Joining us remotely, Renee Graham, associate editor and opinion columnist for the Boston Globe's op-ed page. Yvonne Espinoza Madrigal, executive director for Lawyers for Civil Rights Boston. LaTosha Brown, co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund. And Cheryl Clyburn Crawford, executive director of Mass Vote. Welcome, folks.
Thank you.
Look, this is, I was talking, LaTosha, to a friend in Valdosta, Georgia, and in the very bowels, if you will, of Georgia. And she was expressing extraordinary frustration with the way she has to vote in the coming midterms. She's eager to vote, but she feels that her vote not only won't count, but that if it counts, it will be counted by someone appointed by a Republican legislator who, and legislature rather, who has been inspired by Trump's big lie. Someone who's inspired by the notion that the election was stolen. What are you hearing and what are you feeling and what are you doing right now to assuage her feelings, her concerns, her fears, and those of others?
Well, let me say the first thing is that to affirm what she's feeling is what hundreds of thousands of people are feeling. That millions of folks, I would say, all over this country are on some level feeling some sense of frustration. And while African-American voters were targeted, they're not the only ones that are going to be impacted by this. What we know is that voters, particularly Democratic-leaning, those voters that are considered to be Democratic-leaning voters, when you look at working class voters, when you look at the Latino vote, when you look at AAPI communities, when you look at the Black community, this impacts all of us. And those of us that are in the state of Georgia, we recognize that we're literally being punished for participating. We had the largest historic turnout in this state. And when you see where the growth, 100% of the growth, according to the census, has been communities of color. And so we feel attacked. We feel like our rights are being undermined, but we have been here before. In this moment, as we sit here just a couple of days in for Black History Month, we have to recognize it has been our resilience and our resistance that has actually led us to the point of everything that we've received in this country, policy-wise, has resulted from that. And so even for your friend, I would say I understand. The first, as we're working, I affirm her frustration because I too, as a Black woman in Georgia, a Black voter in Georgia, feel that same sense of frustration. But secondly, I think that it's also important, that we turn that frustration into literally redirecting our power so that we're engaging in the process that we're doing a couple of things. One, I think we've got to do more than vote. That at the end of the day, part of the challenge is that, we have had this laissez-faire kind of approach to voting, that we're going to vote and we're going to let leaders figure it out and then the next 4 years we'll come back. We're telling people that if democracy is to take place, if democracy is to take root, like real true democracy, it is going to take us, we're going to have to make democracy in this country.
In other words,
there are elements of democracy that exist, but we've got to do the work.
In other words, LaTosha, what you're saying is regardless of the impediments, the suppression, clear suppression that's taken place, people are still going to have to get out there and basically mount an offensive against it. Renee, are you feeling that? And can you summarize what we know that Georgia is ground zero for voting suppression? And there's no other way of describing it, by the way. I don't want to, sugarcoat what's happening in the country right now. This is suppression in terms of how it's manifesting, who's coming, who it's directed at. And Georgia's ground zero, but we're seeing this elsewhere as well. Can you talk about what we're dealing with, the scale of laws, if you will, and if not, and of offenses that are basically being directed at largely black and brown voters, but also liberal progressive voters, LGBTQ voters, so on and so forth?
You know, I think, Philip, there's no question, Georgia is ground zero. But we make a mistake if we only pay attention to what's happening in Georgia, because it's happening in Texas and it's happening in Florida. And it's important to note it's happening in New Hampshire, that there are attempts being made in New Hampshire, which the last time I checked was way above the Mason-Dixon line, to enact some of the same sorts of bills and laws that we're seeing in other states. This is not a regional problem. This is a national problem. And I think the most sort of toxic thing that has happened within this discussion is how somehow the right to vote became partisan. Democracy is not partisan. And so when you've made this idea that somehow these are laws that we need to have, but that they're only impacting certain Americans, that's turning this into a partisan fight, and that can't work. What's at stake is democracy. What I constantly think about is when you're talking about democracy, you're talking about citizenship and who gets to access that democracy. And I think about, and I've been thinking about this a lot in the last few months, given all that's been going on. I've been sort of reading again about what happened immediately after the Civil War. And one of the things that happened immediately after the Civil War was the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. What set John Wilkes Booth off was not just the loss of the Confederacy. It was the fact that Lincoln was talking about giving certain Black men the right to vote. And Booth knew that that meant citizenship. So we're not just talking about voting rights, we're talking about American citizenship. That's what's at stake. And that's why everyone should be looking at this as an attack. It doesn't matter what state you're in. Everyone should be viewing this as an attack on democracy. And if we don't have democracy, then we really don't have an America anymore.
And it's so well put. If we don't have a democracy, we don't have America. And a lot of people, of course, do feel that we are sliding towards something unfamiliar in our lifetimes, something that folks have variously described as autocracy as a result of the loss of these democratic norms. And Yvonne, in terms of the law, what recourse is there? You have courts that are packed right now with individuals who basically side with many of the individuals who are trying to change and trying to suppress the vote and so on and so forth. And it's not, of course, just as Renee pointed out, around the country. It's right here. Some feel that there are problems right here in the state of Massachusetts. And Cheryl, we'll get to you in a second to talk about that. But Yvonne, in terms of the law, we saw the invalidation of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, Shelby v. Holder. Where are we right now in terms of what we can do in order to try to prevent further erosion?
Absolutely. Absolutely, Philip. We're talking about an erosion that starts with the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. And the impact of that case is profound. Within the next few years, we see more than 800 polling site closures in states that used to be covered under the protections that were gutted by the Supreme Court in Shelby County. And so just
to go back for just a second, Yvonne, Shelby County, if you don't mind just explaining that just briefly. We know that was about pre-clearance.
Absolutely, yes. And so what was at issue at Shelby County was the federal government's ability to review, or what's technically called pre-clear, changes in voting procedures, in voting processes, in jurisdictions that used to have a history of having a polling test, of excluding Black people on the polling sites, right? If you had a history of, let's call it what it is, of racism and of exclusion of people of color from the voting sites, those jurisdictions were covered under the Federal Voting Rights Act under a specific section called Section 5. And any voting changes in those jurisdictions had to be run up to the Department of Justice for review or pre-clearance. This was challenged by this case, Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, and the Supreme Court voted in favor of essentially allowing these jurisdictions that were past sites of discrimination, violence, and really of undemocratic practices, allows them to just go on their own. And we see immediately the closure of many polling sites, especially in the South, but across the country. As my colleagues have been saying, this is a national phenomenon. And so what's problematic here is that the Supreme Court has also gutted the instruments that would allow lawyers like me, like Lawyers for Civil Rights, to go out and do the voting rights protection work. But obviously, that was just one provision of the Federal Voting Rights Act. Others exist. At Lawyers for Civil Rights, we've been filing voting rights cases under the Voting Rights Act of 1965 with provisions that remain on the books. But I'll be transparent. It makes it much harder because you have to have direct evidence.
Yvonne, even in Massachusetts, you filed you've filed court suits, basically seeking redress for voters here as well. Talk about that just for a bit, and then I want to transition to Cheryl to elaborate.
Absolutely. We have filed a series of high-profile voting rights cases where we actually have evidence of discrimination, evidence of exclusion. We have filed lawsuits against the city of Lowell, against the city of Worcester. And we've also done similar work in other jurisdictions. Right now, we're doing the work in Haverhill. And so this work is critical to make sure that we are implementing the remaining aspects of the Federal Voting Rights Act. Even here in Massachusetts, the technical piece is that it's resource intensive. You need significant data on that level of discrimination and exclusion, things that are under preclearance, which much easier to do. And so this really puts the burden on the community to really advocate for themselves instead of having the federal government enforce the law.
And that's happening with Cheryl. You are, and your organization, you are doing precisely that. In Massachusetts, what just happened, of course, is the Democratic House has passed some of the legislation that you were advocating, but basically decided not to allow for same-day registration. What are your concerns? And reflecting what our other guests have said, we're not seeing the type of voter suppression that we're seeing in the South. But what are you seeing in Massachusetts that is of concern to you, that you feel is impeding the type of thing that we talked about at the top of the show, the democratic process from proceeding unsuppressed?
You're absolutely correct. You know, Massachusetts is not like Texas or Georgia, but we do have issues that keep arising. As you mentioned, we passed the Votes Act bill last week without a very critical piece. It had some great pieces in it, like early voting and mail-in ballots and moving our voter registration date from 20 days to 10 days, as well as jail-based voting. Those are all wonderful new measures that we're going to add, right? But it left out same-day registration. We like to think that we're on the cutting edge. We absolutely are not. 20 other states already have same-day registration and Washington, D.C. It's working. What we do know is that 2/3 of the residents in Massachusetts are really for same-day registration. We also know that where same-day registration has been implemented, it bolsters voter engagement upwards of 17% in the Black and Latino communities especially, right? Where we know that we have all kinds of issues that are happening in those communities, particularly around housing, the housing crisis that we're experiencing and why people move so often and have to change their voter registration. Voter registration doesn't follow them. We need same-day registration. One of the things we're very, very disappointed, and everybody should be disappointed, that really stands for freedom, justice, and equality, right? Like we had political maneuverings that took place in the State House. It may look different from Georgia, but it's the same result because basically it's denying the advancement of voting rights here in Massachusetts.
The bottom line is that people should be allowed to vote. You would think that with all that's gone on, the easier you make it to vote, the better. We saw that in the 2020 election. When you had absentee voting, when you had voting by same-day registration in some cases, where we were able to register in parking lots and so on and so forth, drive-through voting, it made it easier to vote. But it also made people respond in a way that is nefarious, and we saw this in Arizona. LaTosha, going back to Georgia, you just heard from our other guests about some of the things that are happening around the country, right here in Massachusetts and next door in New Hampshire. Georgia, all eyes are still on Georgia. Can you talk about some of the ways in which voters are being denied access, including, but it goes beyond that, of course. You're at a point now where after the people might go to the polls and try to vote, but then it's up to Republican legislators to select those who are going to count the vote. Can you talk about the mechanisms that basically are in place and what you can do about it? If these things are already happening, if the courts aren't going to do anything about it, what resort is there at this point for those voters?
You know, I'm going to share some of the things that are happening in Georgia, but I think people should pay attention to Georgia because Georgia is instructive to how this is happening in different ways all across the country. There's a spectrum of voter suppression. And I often say that there's like 3 core strategies that literally have been used or to suppress the vote in this nation. They're always, no matter how you look at it, for me, they always fall into one of these 3 strategies. There's always a strategy around restricting access to the ballot, whether that's a poll tax, whether that's making additional requirements or credentialing. It is always a problem around there's a strategy of making basic access to the ballot more difficult for communities. We're looking at the Native American community in Arizona and this restriction that you can't use a post office box when if you live on a reservation, that is what you've been using as your mailing address. And so the second strategy has always been around creating this culture of fear, that how do you create this culture of fear that people will be afraid to vote? What we know is if you can go back in Reconstruction, right after Reconstruction, there were 300 African Americans that were elected across the state of Mississippi. Within a matter of days, over 100 of those people were murdered. It was created as and there's always some mechanism to actually have people be fearful. And the third piece is about weaponizing the administrative process, creating and legalizing something that seems like it's harmless on the surface, but in fact, it weakens the process. And so if you look at those 3 elements, we find all of those 3 elements in SB 202, which was the bill that was passed in Georgia immediately after the election last year. And so as a voter in Georgia, I have less voting rights now than I did before. I'm essentially punished for participating in the election. And some of the things that happen when we're talking about access, it's restricting when we're saying that you're shortening absentee ballot the time that you can vote absentee ballot. There's an effort right now underway to actually eliminate drop-off boxes. You know, even closing of polling sites. What we've seen in Lincoln County, there's been a recent fight in Lincoln County to close all of the polling sites with the exception of one in a rural county that there's no public accommodations.
And it's a huge county. It's a huge county, is it not?
It's a huge county. So here you're looking at becomes a transportation barrier. Ultimately, it's around restricting and making access difficult.
Right, I understand it would be like essentially the equivalent of me traveling from here to Springfield to cast my vote, just for those of us here in Massachusetts. And Renee, the passion that LaTosha is exhibiting and that we see around this issue, one question becomes, if Manchin and Sinema, the 2 senators who have basically decided not to endorse getting rid of the filibuster in cases for the John Lewis Civil Rights Bill and other voting legislation, if that's not going to happen, and it's not at this point, it's clear it's not going to happen, what would you suggest voters do and organizations around the country who are fighting to make every vote count? How do you basically get people to the polls in spite of these roadblocks?
You know, I constantly think about the people in this nation's history who died for voting rights. People were murdered trying to ensure voting rights for all. that's one thing to keep in mind. I think there's also a mechanism to pressure your legislatures to get state laws that protect everyone's right to vote. The fact that we're even having this conversation, is absolutely disheartening when you think about where this country has been. But you also have to realize that even when the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, there were still states that had poll taxes. That fight has never really gone away. Now it's just ramped up exponentially because of the big lie, because Republicans clearly have the sense that they can't win unless they cheat. So you end up with things like Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, talking about having a special police force at polling stations. We know exactly why he wants to do that. It's what LaTosha said. You want to create hindrances to access. So I think there has to be a constant diligence, and we can't just lean on people like LaTosha, like Cheryl, like Yvonne to do this work. This is about all of us. And so I think that you need to have pressure on every legislature when you're talking about Massachusetts and not having same-day registration and voting. You need to have more pressure on them to get these things done because, again, we're not just talking about what's happening in one state and one region. This is impacting all of us.
And you just said something really key, the notion of a police force. And in other states, they're talking about observers, partisan observers in election polling areas. And Yvonne, that would seem to be at one point patently, blatantly illegal. How can that even be a possibility? The notion of having partisan election observers in place, intimidating people.
I absolutely believe this is patently illegal even today and challengeable under the Federal Voting Rights Act provisions that still remain. But you're absolutely right, Philip. What we see is that we do not have national minimum standards for what an election should look like, how long a line should be allowed to form for, under 30 minutes, over 30 minutes. Cheryl was talking about what is the deadline for being able to register for voting? What is the time period, number of days for early voting? All of these are national standards that need to be applied. But we need to start creating that wave state by state, starting in Massachusetts with the legislation that Cheryl was talking about, to start building that precedent legislatively for where we want the country to be. And I also want to be very clear about one thing. Intimidation is not just happening in states far-flung from our own backyard. On election day at Lawyers for Civil Rights, we got many reports of voter intimidation in Massachusetts, in Lowell. There were people coming out to polling sites screaming obscenities and racial epithets at Cambodian Americans who were lined up to vote. I mean, this is happening in our own state, and we need to exercise not just voting rights protections, but also state laws to really go after those bad actors and make sure that the polling sites remain accessible for everyone and safe for everyone to be able to cast a meaningful ballot. And if we need to do this in court, we need to go to court for it. But I love what my colleagues are saying. We need to activate community support. It is through community engagement, making sure that enough people are speaking out against this, that we create a movement for change.
And Yvonne, that is a natural transition to Cheryl. Cheryl, you have the last word in this discussion. We have about 2 minutes left in the program. What is exactly happening on the ground in Massachusetts to guarantee that we don't see the type of thing that happened in Lowell, directed at Cambodian voters?
That's right.
I don't know if there's anything that we can do to guarantee that, because we have a much larger problem. Right, we have organizers, grassroots organizations on the ground doing all of the work that's necessary to turn out the community, to have their voices heard, to call their legislators and to really register with them what we want. I think the problem lies in who we have in office. Two things. One, we need to educate everybody that one vote, everybody gets one vote. That is the one place where I feel like we are equal. Everybody gets one vote, but we have to use that vote strategically. We have to take a look at who do we have in office, right? Like, who is it where are the barriers? The barriers are not just the people on the ground. We have too many people working too hard to try to pass legislation. When you have 2/3 of the citizens on the ground saying we want it, and when we know that this initiative really works in our community, yet there's political maneuverings that are happening, politicking that's happening, how do we address that situation? I think we address that situation on the ground by making sure that we put the right legislators in place that represent us. Isn't that how we get them elected? They go up there to represent us. When you get up there, I think some of them forget and they take it on as a job as opposed to their mission. Your mission is to go up there and to represent us. You get up there and take this on as a job and you're protecting your job. We have a bigger problem. And I think it's
yeah, and you in fact have summarized what the rest of our guests have said, who I want to thank, first of all, for this extraordinary conversation. It's been lively, and it's important. That's the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. And we want to thank you for joining us. And now stay with us as we continue our conversation on our digital platforms, Facebook and YouTube. I'm Philip Martin, Senior Investigative Reporter, GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting. We are on Facebook and YouTube with our post show, continuing our discussion on voting rights, making every vote count. Folks, when we left the live part of the program, one of the things I was thinking, of course, is that what this is all about and is not just voter suppression, but voter suppression aimed at a specific voter. Black, brown, LGBTQ, progressive, liberal voters. And the idea is, how do you basically keep the number of votes down? That's the notion of suppression. And how do you keep those folks who are black and brown from going out to the polls? So it's not just a question really of what happens at the polls, but how do you get people to stay home? And one of the things I was talking about when I was talking about Manchin and Cinema in our live broadcast is that they're not going to do anything at this point. So what are the alternative paths to getting people who might be sitting at home and said, I've had enough of my vote is not only is not going to count, but if I vote, someone's going to count it who I don't trust. So I'm just wondering, what are the mechanisms? What are the strategies, tactics even, to encourage people to go from their living room to the polling station in face of clear voter suppression? And LaTosha, I'm going to talk to you about that because of Georgia. Again, if you're sitting somewhere in Atlanta and you have to get to your polling station and you think none of this is going to make a difference and it's not, and it's going to be suppressed no matter what are the alternatives?
You know, Philip, you are actually describing my work. That is exactly what I do every day. And I'll give a prime example of what happens with that. In 2018, I want people to remember what happened in the state of Georgia in 2018. There was a governor's race where Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp were running. That prior to that race, there were hundreds of thousands of voters who had been dropped off the voting rolls. Matter of fact, we actually tried to reach out to at least 100,000 voters that were kicked off the voting rolls months right before the election. And so there was this compounded issue that we saw where we saw massive closing of polling sites between the gutting of the Voting Rights Act in 2013 and that there was this effort that we were literally fighting to keep basic, something like a voting booth open, polling sites. Then people stood in line. I want folks to remember that in the state of Georgia, people stood in line, not 3 hours, not 4 hours, we're talking about 30 minutes. There were people that stood in line last year for 11 hours. I personally were with people who stood in line and voted. We stood with them. The last voter was at 12:37 a.m. Wednesday. So I want people to recognize how egregious this is. The challenge is what we had to do is we had to shift the focus. The focus had to be on using, how do you use anger? How do you use frustration? My grandmother would say, pressure will either crush you or it will transform you. And so we had to take that frustration and transform that to be a call to action. And that's what happened. So what happened in 2020? Actually, in spite of the voter suppression, in spite of all the things that we saw, we came out in record numbers. I can go from not just the 2020 presidential election, let's talk about the runoff. The runoff was specifically designed. It is in the documentation to actually marginalize a big drop off of Black voters. We came out in even higher numbers in the runoff. Part of what we had to do is three things, and I'll say this quickly. The first thing we had to do is shift the focal points. The focal point was not on we're voting for this candidate or particular parties, but that we were voting for ourselves. The second thing is we had to actually have the infrastructure to engage people in a larger conversation, that they didn't just see us around election time, but that we remained that relationship with them. And the third thing is we've got to lift up hope that in the midst of what is happening right now, while it is a suppression, right, where we're seeing this oppression, we had to remind people we're being suppressed because we're winning, not because we're losing. And so literally just shifting the frame, doing the work, creating the infrastructure can get the kind of outcomes that we expect that we're going to continue to that.
Cheryl, I see you nodding to what LaTosha was saying. You are, this is an amen moment for you. What do you find something similar? She's in Georgia, you in Massachusetts. What do you tell me about your agreement or disagreement with this?
Absolutely. All of that was resonating with me. That's right. You have to take that anger, because I'm still a little teed off about the other day, but you have to take that anger and you have to turn it into action. You have to instill in people that you just cannot give up. That's what they want us to do. You say your vote doesn't matter. Clearly, your vote matters. I can think of an instance here in Massachusetts. City Councilwoman Julia Mejia won by one vote. Literally, they had to do a recount. She won by one vote. Your vote matters. How do you know it matters? Because they wouldn't try so hard to keep you from voting if it didn't matter. They know that you, as an individual, can make a difference. And when we come together, I am so proud of Georgia. That's right. They took that anger, turned it around, and came out and we've been trying to copy you ever since, right? Like on the ground, out here, turning out people, registering people to vote, but just making sure that we address the gap between those that are registered and you getting to the poll. We don't have it as bad. It's not as egregious, but long lines are long lines for whatever reason.
Renee, what is the end game here? What do you feel that there seems to be a plan in place, a template for voter suppression around the country, from Nevada to Georgia to New Hampshire, that's being emulated, and then it's impacting voters from Massachusetts to Alaska. What is the end game here for those who are attempting to put into place these nefarious laws?
I think it's twofold. I think on one hand, it's to disenfranchise millions, tens of millions of people in this country. But I also think there's this sense that, there are a lot of people on the right, a lot of Republicans who would prefer an authoritarian government. They don't want a government for the people and by the people. They want power and they want control. And if this is the way they have to go about getting it, they're going to get it. But I think it's exactly what LaTosha and Cheryl said. My mother used to say, tell me I can't do something and watch my speed. You're not going to take away my rights. And I'm not going to sit by and let that happen. Because if you do that, the terrorists win. If they shock you into, okay, well, my vote doesn't count, or I'm afraid to go to the polls, then they get what they want easily. You have to fight back with everything you want, because everything this country stands for and everything this country should be is at stake right now. And, we're not talking about, this sort of small, voting is everything. That is why we are a democracy. It's time to expand voting. It's time to make voting easier. We've spent centuries making it difficult for people to vote. It's time to actually do the opposite and people understand that this is it. If we don't have our right to vote, if we can't trust who is counting those ballots, then we're done as a country. Then we become the country that we think other places are. Then we're that country.
I'm going to transition to Yvonne, and then I'm going to come back and ask everyone what you think the next steps should be. But Yvonne, this question, what we're also seeing, of course, is a lot of the new laws and proposed legislation by largely Republican legislators. This is based on Trump's assertion that is a lie, that he won the election and that it was stolen from him, and that those who voted in this past election, largely in the cities, urban areas, places like Atlanta and Detroit, basically cheated is what they're asserting. In terms of the law, in terms of what you can do at this point, given that you have limited, the courts have had very limited responses right now to what's going on, with one exception, Ohio. What do you think are the next steps in terms of the law? And I will go around to our other guests and ask next steps.
I think the key here is deploying multiple methodologies simultaneously. It requires continuing activity in the court. It requires continued legislative advocacy, and it requires community empowerment, engagement, and deployment. It requires all of these strategies to be deployed simultaneously. And it's really incredible. We filed the Lowell lawsuit, which we had to litigate for 2 years, ultimately won that case. We filed a lawsuit against Worcester, and Worcester had seen what happened with Lowell, how expensive it was for Lowell to try to keep the status quo in place, how unpopular it became within the electorate in Lowell that this was dragging out in court. People wanted to get ahead of this, not to get entrenched. And so the next time, right, in Worcester, we were able to get a much more expedited, favorable resolution because they didn't want to spend the money to fight in court. They didn't want to run the risk of alienating voters. And so we need to create legal strategies that combine not just community engagement pieces and communication pieces, but that also really centralize modernizing and democratizing the election process. And I'm also going to say one more thing, which is that it's critical that at times when people are trying to push us back into a corner and into the dark ages, that we come out swinging from the front. What we need to do in Massachusetts is authorize the people to vote to not just include the traditional categories that have been marginalized, like people of color or people with criminal convictions, but also undocumented people. Let's get them into the polls. Let's do the things that are going to incentivize mass democratization to showcase exactly what full empowerment looks like, and then let's give them something to talk about.
And that's about to happen apparently in New York City, am I correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where they have in fact moved in that direction. Cheryl, next steps in terms of voting rights in the face of voter suppression?
The first thing that they can do, because that bill is not done yet, it's in conference, and we compromised from same-day registration to election day registration, just to give us something that would allow us to have people have access to the ballot after the voter registration deadline, but on election day, whether that's through same-day registration or election day registration. I think what we need in Massachusetts are bold leaders that are willing to take bold measures. And I really want to lift up Representative Nika Elugado, who, when we needed someone to file an amendment when they took SDR out of it, she was one of the few people, very, very few people that was willing to stand up and file that amendment when she knew how political it was. We knew how it. And so I really want to make sure that we lift her up and say that's exactly what we need. People that are not afraid to make bold moves, because that's what we need right now in Massachusetts.
Bold moves. Renee, voting, next steps, voting rights in the face of voter suppression.
You know, I keep coming back to this. There has to be a way to convince people that what is happening elsewhere can happen where you are. And I think there's this kind of attitude that, like, well, you know, Massachusetts is great, you know, and we're liberal. Donald Trump got 1 million votes in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. We know that what's happening in Georgia or what's happening in Florida and all the things that Yvonne was talking about in Lowell with the Cambodian population, that is happening here. There are already measures that are making it more difficult for people to vote. And it might not look like what's happening in Texas or Georgia, but it is happening here. And I think people have to, you know, understand that there's a vigilance necessary to protect your rights. And I don't know that we've ever needed that as much as we need it right now.
LaTosha, in Georgia, ground zero, next steps in the face of extraordinary voter suppression.
Well, you know, power concedes nothing without a demand. And so for us in Georgia, we're fighting on all levels. We're fighting, we're taking our fight to the streets. We're organizing, getting more people engaged in the process because we think that that pressure point, that is how democracy takes place. That is what happens to hold elected officials accountable. We're taking it to the courts. We have several lawsuits that are filed, and not only in Georgia, but in Florida and other states as well. We're fighting in the courts, right? And then I think then we're also literally fighting this narrative. That part of what we're not talking about is that part of the reason that this big lie was able to gain root is that there's a narrative that is being lifted up. We have to have a counter narrative that really shows the possibilities of a different America, that we have a radical reimagination to make sure that we have the kind of democracy that we desire and we deserve, and that people are having victories, that in the midst of the voter suppression, we're still winning. In the midst of all of the things that the Republicans are doing, we're still beating them. And so we need to lift that up, that literally when people come together, we're educated, we're determined, that when we work together, we win.
That is a perfect ending for today's program. And LaTosha, I want to thank you. Renee, Yvonne, Cheryl, thank you very much for an extraordinary program and putting the accent on voting rights in the face of voting suppression.